Hello, everyone. This is Savannah Bekowski, Project Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Financial Management for Water and Wastewater Funding Program Applicants. To give you all of an idea of where others on the webinar are tuning in from, we have prepared this map. You can see that we have attendees spread all throughout your state. Thanks to you all for joining us today. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to our speaker for today. Today we have Glenn Barnes, Associate Director at the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. Glenn, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Savannah, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on financial management for water and wastewater funding program applicants. Just a quick word on this particular project and how we've come to be talking to you this morning. We have been the recipient of some grant funding from the U.S. EPA to provide training and technical assistance for small water systems across the U.S., including in Minnesota. And as part of that process, we interact with the primacy agencies in each state to learn more about the needs of systems and how we could be most helpful in the areas of finance and management. And so from those conversations, it became clear that what would be a good benefit for Minnesota was to provide today's webinar where we talk not really so much about the project priority list, we will start off with that, but ways that you as a system can improve your finance and management so that way if your projects on the project priority list are deemed necessary and acceptable for funding, that you have the finances in place to be able to take those loans and grants and make good use out of them. And so we've worked particularly closely with Chad Kolstad and Bill Dunn, Becky Saby, and Jeff Freeman, and we're very grateful for their collaboration for the content that we have today. Our project website, efcnetwork.org, is the best place to get all information on what's going on. And in addition to today's webinar, we will have an opportunity at the end for you to request technical assistance from us, which again is free to you and covered by our grant if you are a small water system. And also we have a blog that you can sign up for if you're interested. So just to get straight into the material, as I said, we'll start off just with a quick review of the project priority list, but then really focus the rest of the hour on some discussion of understanding your system's current financial position. So as you are considering capital needs and available funding, what do your finances look like right now? And then finally, how do we raise the appropriate revenues we need to pay for those capital improvements as well as our operating expenses and debt service and other needs? And I think as we get into the discussion of the project priority list, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, I think the first place that we wanted to start was just with the, perhaps alphabet soup, if you will, of the acronyms that come with doing environmental services. So, I remember reading somewhere that NASA's guide to their acronyms is an 88-page document. I think maybe those of us in environmental services could even have them beat. But certainly just the key ones for today, of course, these you'll be most familiar with, DW and CW, drinking water and clean water. And again, on the clean water side here, in particular regards to the SRF program, the State Revolving Fund, we're talking about wastewater and stormwater as well. PPL is the project priority list that we'll discuss in a little bit more detail here, and then that will drive into the intended use plan, which is a list of ranked projects that are ready for funding under that SRF grant, or SRF loan program, excuse me. Some of the key agencies to know that are involved in this, the Minnesota Department of Health, or MDH, which is the primacy agency for drinking water, and MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, which is the primacy agency for wastewater. And then PFA, the Public Facilities Authority, which deals with the state revolving funds and some of the funding programs. And then another state agency that's involved in a federal funding program is DEED, the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. And then in terms of those actual programs, SRF is state revolving funds, which are infrastructure loans. PSIG is the Point Source Implementation Grant. SCDP is the Small Cities Development Program. WIF is the Wastewater Infrastructure Fund, which are affordability grants. And then finally, RD is USDA Rural Development, and USDA being a major funder of any kind of economic development for small town and rural America, in particular on the public facility side. So the project priority list is Minnesota's list for water and wastewater infrastructure projects. So this is a way for the state to identify cities and communities seeking funding for wastewater projects or drinking water infrastructure projects. And this goes over the next 5 years. So there's a long time horizon for this list. And if you're interested in having the state be involved in your funding decisions, it's important to get on the list, because this is going to help the state understand which funders to approach about the projects that you want to do, and the score is going to help them understand which programs are going to be eligible for funding. So that's the start of the idea of the project priority list. And what happens is you as a community, as a water or wastewater system, will submit a project priority list request to either MPCA for clean water or MDH for drinking water as a first step in the funding process. And so generally, state agencies have put out notices this month for those projects. It goes to a mailing list that includes every city and water utility as well as the consulting engineer. And so this is the first step in the process. The deadline for the clean water project priority list to MPCA is the first Friday in March. And then for the drinking water side, the deadline to MDH is the first Friday in May. And then those agencies will make recommendations to the Public Facilities Authority by the first Friday in June for the intended use plan. And that is where the State Revolving Fund program comes into play. So again, this is an annual notice that goes out, and this is a program that is really there for everybody. And it costs very little money to get on the list, and then you know your options, and this is a way for the state to help track your needs. I'll say this because we work in Minnesota and we work across the country in states working with funding agencies. Funders want to hear from systems when you have needs, and they want to work with you to make sure that those needs are met in any way possible. And so, you know, part of our recommendation as part of today's webinar is that if you have capital needs, and you know, get on the project priority list as a first step, because that's where the state will then be able to start working with you and help you understand the steps you need to take to be eligible for that funding and to secure it and to be able to pay the funding back. So essentially, the state loan and grant funding follows those project priority list priorities. And then even some federal programs like the USDA program and the Small Cities Development Program are going to also consider the PPL priorities. And in Minnesota, there's a coordination between these funding entities, which is something that increasingly we see in states, where these funders are talking to each other and they're ultimately deciding of how best to support infrastructure projects. And it may be to say, okay, you know, community X needs infrastructure done, who's the best funder for them this year? Or perhaps a combination of funding from several sources. And that coordination ultimately helps you as cities and as communities receive the money you need to run your water systems effectively. So the state puts a lot of effort into this, but again, you know, I remember when I was younger, there were ads for the lottery that said, you know, you can't win if you don't play. You know, I think with the water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure funding, you know, you're not going to be on the radar of the state without getting first on the project priority list. Now, ultimately, your score and rank on that list is based on public health and environmental impacts. So the state is going to grade your project essentially looking at those particular needs on either the water or wastewater side and the varying funding program requirements. But it's certainly true that if, especially for loans, if your financial situation is not in a good place, even if you have that public health and environmental need, it's going to be very difficult for you to pay back the money that needs to be loaned out to you. So again, from our discussion, what we wanted to do with the focus of today's webinar is to talk about the ways that you can improve your funding situation, so that way when you have a project that shows these public health and environmental needs, that you're going to be able to have that funding structure in place to be able to handle the funding coming in. And just kind of a graphic interpretation of what we're talking about. So we start with those clean water and drinking water project priority lists. And then, you know, in the state programs, we have the SRF program, the low interest loans. We have the PSIG program, which are grants to meet more stringent pollution limits. And again, the WIF, affordability-based grants. And then on the federal funding side, again, drawing out of those PPLs, we have the USDA RD, which are loans and grants. And then also the Small Cities Development Program, the block grants that are administered by deed. So again, there it's a federal program being administered by a state agency. So this is the universe of what happens when you get on the project priority list. And again, because it's looking at a 5-year horizon, those announcements are out there right now, and the deadlines will be coming up in the next couple of months for both of them. We really strongly encourage you, if you have project needs, to go ahead and get on the list. But beyond that, once you get on the list, oh, sorry, one more thing just to mention, the state has put together a really helpful community options for water and wastewater infrastructure financing guide. And when we post the webinar and recording of the webinar, the slide deck and the recording on our website, we will also post this guide for you, so you all get a copy of this as well, that Bill Dunn put together. And it's about a 4-page document that outlines a lot of the different funding programs. But as I said, I mean, I think as you want to consider the need to get on the list, or perhaps you've already submitted to be on the project priority list, and you're thinking about how to improve your chances of receiving funding and being able to pay for those financing needs, what we'd like to do is spend the balance of our call this morning talking about, first, how to understand where your system is sitting financially right now. And we're going to show you some objective measures for that I hope you'll find to be very interesting and very helpful. And again, as I mentioned, for those of you that are small water systems, we have some technical assistance available under our grant. If you're interested to help you run these numbers, there's a spreadsheet tool I'll show you as well a little bit later in the presentation. And then from there, we'll shift gears and talk about how to bring in the money that you need to really to meet these future needs. So starting with understanding your water system's financial position, you know, I think it comes to this question that we often ask in the trainings and one-on-one meetings is, financially speaking, how can you sleep at night? You know, is your system self-sufficient? Are you able to cover your debt service after paying your day-to-day operations? So if you borrow money, you're going to have a fixed repayment schedule for that. Are you able to cover those payments? If your customers stop paying their bills, how long can you maintain operations? Or if you have a disproportionately large water customer leave, like say a textile mill or a pulp and paper mill, something like that, closed down, you know, how long can you maintain operations with that loss of income? And then can you meet your short-term obligations? I mean, literally the bills sitting on your desk right now, do you have the money to pay for them? And, you know, we'll sometimes poll the audience when we're doing this in a workshop to say, you know, how do you sleep at night? And, you know, option one is we sleep like a baby, although I did have somebody at a workshop say, well, I have a 2-month-old girl who wakes up screaming every 2 hours, and if that's what you mean, then I would say, yes, that's exactly how I'm sleeping. So, but, you know, maybe you're sleeping comfortably. Maybe there's some tossing and turning. Maybe you're an insomniac. Maybe you're in need of some heavy medication to get through the night, whatever the case is. But what we want to show you is some ways to actually put some numbers to these questions and to look at some financial measures. So we're going to take a little bit of time now and run through 4 of these measures: operating ratio, debt service coverage ratio, days of cash on hand, and then current ratio. And these are all measures that can tell you how you are doing financially as a water system. And I want to mention that we've put together a really nice whiteboard video on these financial measures that is free and available. And again, when we send out the presentation slides from today after the webinar is over, you'll get a copy of this link. And you can go and watch this video. It's about 10 minutes long, and it explains these financial measures in a good bit of detail with some nice animation. We are not going to show the video through the webinar because, unfortunately, the webinar technology isn't quite good enough to show video, but I am going to give you a little bit of an overview of what the video talks about, but then that video is available for you to share with others in your governments and in your water systems who may be interested in seeing it. So the first place that we want to start is with the financial measure of operating ratio, which is a measure of financial sufficiency, which is basically to say we want to look at your annual operating revenue and we want to divide that by your annual operating expenses. And obviously, it goes without saying, I hope, that we want the operating revenue to be more than the expenses, or at the very least, the same as the expenses. And so this is a really easy measure that you can have that will show you whether or not your rate structure and customer usage levels and the fees that you charge, etc., are sufficient to cover the costs, the day-to-day costs of running your water system. So here we're really talking about salaries, power bills, chemical bills, fuel for your vehicles, minor repairs on the system, your insurance costs, the day-to-day costs of running a water system. But one of the items that we encourage you to consider as part of your operating ratio is depreciation. And depreciation is a little bit of a funny animal for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It can basically be made out to say that it is the annual cost of wear and tear on the water system. So the video that we have uses the example of a car as sort of a model for how to talk about water system financial management. And as you can see in the screenshot here, the driver's frowning because the tires on his car are flat. And so in the video, we talk about how, what depreciation would mean is that he would know that those tires would last him, I don't know, say 4 years when he bought them, and that, say each, in total, the tires were maybe $600. So every year, those tires lost about $150 of their value. So that way, over the course of the 4 years, if he had put away $150 a year at the end of that time period, he would have saved enough money to replace those assets, the tires, in their original condition at their original purchase price. And so depreciation can be a proxy in operating ratio for whether or not you're saving to cover the value that's lost as your infrastructure wears out. Because we all know that over time, infrastructure does wear out. And so depreciation is something, though, I should mention, that is measured by your accountants. This is not something that necessarily is done by your system engineer, although your system operators and engineers can have some input into how the accountants measure depreciation. But it's an economic fact for any water system that any asset we have over time will lose its value. And I should mention that the most typical way that we think about it losing value is through physical factors or just the wear and tear of it. But there are also functional or non-physical factors that can cause an asset to lose value. And those would be that perhaps there's new regulation coming down from EPA or the state that says, the way that we have to handle certain chemicals has changed, and therefore this piece of equipment is no longer useful for us. So that's a part of depreciation as well. And a part that we sometimes don't think about. I think it's easier to think about, well, asset has 10 years of useful life and it costs $10,000, so every year it loses $1,000 of value. So we did a webinar recently, a full hour webinar on depreciation, where we had a discussion with an accountant who works exclusively with water and wastewater systems, and he explained to us how depreciation works. So if you have some more questions about it, we recommend that you go and watch this webinar. And again, contact us if you have any questions, and the link for it will be available on the slide deck when you receive it. But generally speaking, we advise that you at least measure operating ratio both with and without depreciation, because they tell slightly different stories. And if we include depreciation in there as a cost, and if we're charging enough revenue to cover that cost, it's some indication that we are recovering some of the lost value of assets, and that money can either be put in the bank, or it could be put towards a capital reserve program, or it could be put into towards debt service to replace assets over time. And obviously, as I said, we want this operating ratio to be above 1. In fact, I would say if you're including depreciation, it would be nice to have it a little bit closer to 1.2. And if you're not, you might want to even have it as high as 1.5. Because as we'll discuss as we go on, just covering your day-to-day expenses is not necessarily a good business plan. It doesn't give you money in the bank that you need for emergencies, for unexpected revenue shortfall. And then also, as we go on to the next topic of debt service, it also does not give you enough money to have a little bit of security on your debt, which funders are often going to want to see. So that's operating ratio. Probably the easiest of the financial measures to understand, and one that we really encourage all of you to take a look at. The second measure is debt service coverage ratio, and this is a measure of your ability to pay back any money that you've borrowed after you pay off your operating expenses. And so the way that we calculate this particular measure is we take operating revenues for the year and we subtract out the annual operating expenses. And in this case, we want to exclude depreciation because we're really just looking to see if we have money left over. And then we take that remaining balance and divide it by the principal and interest payments on long-term debt. So if we were, for example, to take the operating revenue and subtract out the operating expenses, and it comes to $50,000 is the balance in the top of the equation here, and then your principal and interest payments were $40,000, you would have an a debt service coverage ratio greater than 1, meaning you have enough money to be able to pay back your debt service and then have a little bit extra as well. However, if we run this equation and you've got $50,000 left over but $100,000 of debt, you're going to be in a bit of trouble. And you're going to have to look for other sources other than your operating revenue, which is the money you get from your customers, in order to pay back that debt. Now, in Minnesota, the SRF borrowers are required to issue a general obligation revenue note to secure the SRF loan. And while the SRF program itself does not mandate a certain debt service coverage ratio, state law requires a 105% revenue coverage for all general obligation debt. So what that basically means is that when we run this debt service coverage ratio, it needs to come out to at least 1.05. And that would be the minimum target for systems in Minnesota to be able to meet that state law requirement. Now, I think your debt and bond covenants, if you're borrowing money outside of the state programs, are going to mandate exactly what this number needs to be. And you may actually find in many cases that it will be higher than the 1.05. It may be, if you're in non-governmental program lending, that you'll see a requirement as high as 1.2 or maybe even a little bit higher than that. And the idea there is that there has to be a little bit of cushion in case you have a lean year. Certainly, we have unexpected events in terms of revenue shortfall, not just, say, a large customer leaving, but, the potential for drought, potential for a very rainy summer where people aren't watering their lawns as much, or whatever the case may be. The people who loan you money in order to feel somewhat assured they're going to get paid back want a little bit of a cushion, and that's what debt service coverage ratio measures. And debt service coverage ratio and operating ratio really give us the broadest perspective of the financial health of your water and wastewater system, because they are based on annual numbers. So whether we're going to draw this from your financial statements or from your budget or whatever the case is going to be, you're going to be able to look at these numbers on an annual basis. But the other two measures that we want to talk about, days of cash on hand and current ratio are going to really be a snapshot in time. They're very helpful, but they are a snapshot in time because generally we don't do a rolling average of the amount of cash we have sitting around on a day-to-day basis for the entire year. In fact, I'm going to show you an example in a minute of how to calculate these numbers, and that uses audited financial statements. And on the audited financial statements, the unrestricted cash and investments that we have up on the screen here will literally be the unrestricted cash and investments on the day your auditor prepared your financial statement, which might be the last day of your fiscal year, whatever that would be. So for days of cash on hand, we want to take a look at that cash that we have on hand right now and then divide it by the cost of running your water system on a daily basis. So what that would mean would be the operating expenses, excluding depreciation again, so just what does it cost to run the system day in and day out, and then divide that by 365. And of course we divide it by 365 because what we're trying to do here is to look at the daily rate, whereas the operating expenses, excluding depreciation, is what you would have on an annual basis. So we try to get a daily rate and then divide that into the amount of cash we have on hand, and that tells us how many days of cash we have. So for example, of a kind of a simple example, if it costs $10,000 a day to run the water system and you have $100,000 in the bank, you only have 10 days of cash on hand, whereas if it, say, costs $10,000 a day to run the water system and you have $10 million in the bank, you have 100 days of available money available for you. So these are the kinds of numbers we want to look at. And again, we'll look at an example in a minute that will put some actual numbers to this calculation. Now, days of cash on hand, there is not a natural target for this. It's really more up to the system to decide, what we're comfortable with. But I will say in Minnesota, the state is going to look for you to have 3 months of cash on hand plus 1 year of debt service when you are applying for funding. And if you do not have 90 days of cash on hand and a year of debt service available, there's going to be some discussion between the state and your system about whether or not you have the sufficient funds to be able to take on loan and grant programs, and that they'd like to see you maintain this level of days of cash on hand. So again, while there's no natural kind of benchmark for this in Minnesota, there is a very state-specific requirement that you should be aware of and be considering as you look at your financial position. And then finally, the current ratio. And the current ratio, again, is a snapshot in time. If you take it from your financial statements, it's going to be based on your ability to pay the bills that are currently sitting on your desk. So we look at the amount of cash that you have on hand, and in this case, it's going to include both cash and then net receivables. So if you've just sent out bills to your customers, plus literally the cash that you have in the bank, and then divide that by the current liabilities that you have. So that's going to be every bill sitting on your desk right now that's due for payment. And obviously, again, just like with operating ratio, we want higher revenue than expenses. Like with debt service coverage, that we want higher net revenue than debt payments. Here, we obviously want higher unrestricted assets than we want current liabilities. We want to have more money on hand than we have owed at the moment. And so, you want this number, when calculated, to be at least greater than 1. And realistically, you probably want it to be a fair bit greater than 1, because if you think about it, if the ratio is exactly 1, that's going to indicate that if every bill were due today, you would have exactly the right amount of money to pay them, and then you would be out of unrestricted money. And so one of the reasons that this measure is a little bit more tenuous to calculate is that on the day your financial statements were prepared, or on the day that your budget is prepared, it may be the case that you are expecting a lot of customers to pay their bills back. I mean, at least here we do have net receivables built into that, but you may be waiting on that. You may have just the day before gotten a very large electricity bill, or you may have the day before or the day after the financials are prepared be expecting that large electricity bill. And so, this will give you a measure of what it's like on that day, but it's up to you to understand whether or not that particular day is representative of a typical day for your water system. But anyway, nevertheless, this is a good measure along with the days of cash on hand to show you what you can expect just in terms of today, how are we sitting from a cash financial position. So what I'd like to do to help explain these measures in a little bit more detail is to give you an example. And so I've chosen the town of Mayberry. I will note that's not the actual name of the town. Had to pick Mayberry being from North Carolina. It's a typical small town and had to go with the Andy Griffith Show reference. But essentially, what we're going to look at are the actual numbers from an actual community in the country. And we took their financial statements and we're going to use those to calculate these four numbers for you. So what we're going to start off with is the operating ratio. And what you see on the screen here on the left is a screenshot of their financial statement. And this is the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position, one of three statements that we will need for calculating these numbers. And for those of you who have not worked much with your financial statements before, most likely as governmental systems, your water and wastewater utilities will be what's called an enterprise fund or a proprietary fund, which means that unlike the general fund of the government that's largely supported by taxes, these are self-sufficient business units that are more supported by fees. And so these statements will be broken out, generally speaking, for your water and wastewater separately, and that's the information that we want to look at. So this particular sheet, which you can find in your financial statements, and then on the right we have a worksheet where you plug the numbers in. We start with operating ratio. So as we said, we need total operating revenue, which in this case here is $444,231, and then total operating expenses, which are $511,448. And again, without doing any math, we can already see the expenses are more than the revenues. We're not going to be happy with the number that we see. But the actual calculation here is going to show an operating ratio of 0.87. And what that means is for Mayberry, for the year that we are looking at, they did not bring in enough revenue to cover their day-to-day expenses plus to cover depreciation, because depreciation is included in that $511,448 number. So they did not bring in enough money in this given year that we're looking at to cover the day-to-day operations and to cover the value that their assets had lost. But we can also calculate the operating ratio without depreciation just to see if they covered their day-to-day expenses. So again, the total operating ratio, or revenue, excuse me, is $444,231. Total operating expenses hasn't changed. It's still $511,448. But now as you see one line above that, the depreciation line is there, which is $142,463. And so what we do here is a little bit of quick math. So $511,448 minus $142,463. And that gives us an operating expense excluding depreciation of $368,985. And now when we run the number, the ratio comes out to be 1.2. And again, that means that the operating revenue for this given year for this system was more than the operating expenses when you exclude the value of the assets that were lost. So day in and day out, Mayberry is able to cover their expenses from an operating perspective, but they're not setting enough aside for future capital needs. And so when you apply for projects through the PPL, this is one of the things that the state is going to look at is your financial position, and this is one of the measures that you can take a look at on your own ahead of time to understand really, what kind of financial shape are you in. And so for Mayberry, yes, it's great that they can cover their day-to-day expenses, but it's probably a bit concerning that they're not really setting aside much to cover future capital needs. So that's the first measure. The second measure the debt service coverage ratio, we're going to need some of the same numbers as before, as you recall, but then we're also going to need to get the annual principal and interest payments on capital debt, and that's going to come from the statement of cash flows. So what we find is, again, 444,231 is the operating revenue, and then the 511,448 minus 142,463 will be the operating expenses excluding depreciation that we'll need to work with. But then in terms of the debt payments here, the principal and interest are separated out into two lines on their financial statement. It may be the case it's only one line on your statement. And they're 49,655 and 35,128. So when we do the math, 444,231 minus 368,985 on the top. And then on the bottom, we're going to add together those two numbers and divide it by 84,763. And the resulting ratio is 0.89, meaning that once Mayberry has covered all of their operating expenses for the year, they did not have enough money left over to pay the principal and interest they owed in that year on their long-term debt. So as we said, the debt service coverage ratio in Minnesota, the requirement with geodebt is to be at least 1.05. Your lender, if you go with a private lender, may actually recommend a higher number. So this is going to be a very concerning number to lenders, that Mayberry is not anywhere near that level, and in fact, they're not even bringing in enough money this year to cover expenses. And so what they probably ended up having to do, I would suspect, is to either dip into their fund balance to cover the shortfall in the debt payments, or potentially they dipped into the general fund in order to cover those losses. So, you know, as a utility, if you run this number and find that it comes out below 1, and the operating ratio, including depreciation here, is below 1, we're starting to see some red flags for Mayberry, and I think lending programs are going to be very cautious about wanting to share their resources with Mayberry because they're not sure of whether or not they'll get paid back fully. Now again, those two being the best measure of kind of your financial sufficiency for the year and gives us that broad perspective, we do want to take a look though at these snapshot numbers as well. And so the first is that days of cash on hand. So we're going to look now both at the original statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position, and now also the statement of net position for the proprietary fund. That's where we're going to get our current cash allocation. And so that current cash is $107,706. And then we already know that the annual operating expense is $511,448. The depreciation is $142,463. And so when we do the math, the unrestricted cash and cash equivalents here is $107,706. $368,985 divided by 365 is the daily operating expense, which, if you can see, comes out to roughly $1,000 a day. And therefore, Mayberry has 107 days of cash on hand. And as you recall from what we said earlier, the state would want you to have 90 days of cash on hand plus your annual debt payments. And so Mayberry is probably just on the line of where they need to be, maybe slightly below where they would need to be if they were a Minnesota community and they were looking to get onto the to get projects funded. So again, this is probably an indication. Again, it's a snapshot in time because this particular cash number does not include receivables. So, you know, if they were a quarterly water system and they were about to send out bills the day after these financials were prepared, that cash number may be low. But generally speaking, this is going to be, again, a little bit of a red flag for funders as they take a look at this. And finally then, the current ratio, which is the ratio of your cash on hand plus receivables to your current bills. And we're just going to need the statement of net position for this one. So 107,706 we know is the current unrestricted cash. The receivables are $41,870. And then the total current liabilities is $108,390. And so when we run this ratio, it comes out to 1.38, which means that at the moment, Mayberry has 138% of the money it needs to pay its current liabilities. But I do want you to note on here that if you actually look at the cash in hand today, not the receivables of what they're owed from their customer, but the actual cash in hand versus the bills, they're actually slightly below 1. And what that means is that they're really going to rely on those customers to pay their bills. And the way financial statements are done, the receivables, the reason it's net receivables is that it does factor in that certain customers won't. And I think generally speaking, our customers are good at paying their bills for many water systems. So it's probably a safe bet that Mayberry will get the cash returned to them before those bills are due. But what this is really telling me is that they are kind of living paycheck to paycheck, if you will, as a community. So these are 4 numbers that you can run to give yourself and your decision makers, your elected board, and even your customers a sense of your current financial position. And I think as many of you struggle with how to pay for future capital needs, it's really important, first off, to understand where you are financially. And I think I've had many conversations with water systems that say, you know, my gut tells me we're doing really well, or my gut tells me we're really not doing well. And these numbers are a way for you to calculate a little bit more objectively whether or not you're doing well and how you compare to national standards and to state benchmarks as well. And so we really encourage all of you, if you've not gone through the exercise of calculating these numbers, that you should do that. And I think it will give you a place to start the conversation about the financial position of your water system and what may need to happen in terms of your revenues for you to be in a good position to take on debt or to take on whatever you need to in order to pay for your future capital needs. Now, we have a spreadsheet tool that will run all of these numbers for you. If you were actually taking our in-person workshop for the day, we would have passed these out to you with calculators and had you do the math by hand, because I think that's a good way to really understand what we're calculating. But what this Excel tool, which is freely available to you on our project website, you can download it. What it will allow you to do is to basically plug in the 8 or 10 raw numbers that we were looking at on those financial statements, or that you could perhaps get from your budgets if necessary. And then the tool will go ahead and calculate all the ratios for you. And again, if you are a small water system and want some assistance with this, please let us know and we'll be happy to walk you through how to use the tool and how to interpret it. Because I think one of the things I really want to stress is, you know, if I were having the conversation with Mayberry, it would not be like, oh wow, Mayberry's in kind of not great financial shape and therefore, you know, we're going to give up on them. I think the conversation is, okay, we're not in great financial shape, but if we're able to raise rates some, then we can improve all of these numbers across the board and be in a better position to pay back the loans that we need for infrastructure. So it's really meant to start the conversation and help you think about the direction that you want to go in financially as a water system. So I don't really think that you can adequately plan for long-term needs and adequately think about how to set your rates or how to increase your revenues without really understanding where you're starting from. And that's what this tool and what this exercise is intended to do. So again, this is the first step in the process. What I want to spend the balance of our time together talking about, though, are revenues. Because obviously it's one thing to know your financial position, it's another thing to apply for the project priority list and perhaps be, you know, approved for some of these programs, but eventually we're going to need some money here. And I think it's a good way to think about is how we pay for the big ticket items of water systems, whether it's treatment plants or wells or pipes or motors or vehicles, hydrants, meters, whatever the case may be. You know, there's basically 4 ways that you can pay for capital improvements. The first is that you can pay as you go. You'll get money in the door every month. You'll get money going out the door every month. And if you're able to cover the cost of some of the capital improvements with that cash in and cash out, that's an option for you. Generally speaking, for big ticket items, that's not a common option. The second is that you can save money in advance and pay it off over time. And that's perhaps the strategy that you would have with something like depreciation. because depreciation would be a proxy for the amount of money that you might want to set aside. Again, it's not a perfect measure, and it's not the same as having an equipment replacement fund, but you really want to think about that as a way of thinking about the long-term needs of your system. So we're not recommending necessarily that you accumulate large sums of money to pay for everything in cash. Obviously, the cost of things go up over time, and debt, the next bullet here, is an option. But you might want to think about having a mix of paying in cash and paying in debt. The third thing up here, obviously, paying later. You borrow money and you pay it off over time. It's always a good option with water and wastewater infrastructure because of their long useful life. And then finally, the one that we all love, grants, because we let somebody else pay for it. And as we talked about at the beginning, there are some grant programs available in the state, and we really encourage you to take advantage of those. But generally speaking, grant funding, especially coming from the federal level, has been more limited over time. Those of you who have been around in this industry since, say, the 70s and 80s and remember the construction grants that were around, especially after the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act were passed, those days are unfortunately at this moment really long gone, and so the grants are a little bit harder to find. And when you take grants off of this list, everything else up there, pay as you go, save in advance and pay, or pay later, is money that comes from your customers and comes from your revenue. So how you bring in money becomes a really critical question. And it gets to this issue of full cost pricing, that we want to set our rates in such a way that it covers not just the O&M costs and taxes and accounting costs, but it's also going to be able to cover contingencies for emergency, principal and interest payments on long-term debt, reserves for capital improvement, and then especially for those of you who have source water, how to protect that source water and have it be perhaps less dirty and less of a cost to have to clean it to get it to be drinkable in the first place. But the thing is that systems generally like low rates, and especially I think we know when there are governing boards involved that they particularly like to keep costs low for their customers. And don't get me wrong, we don't want to encourage you to charge any more to customers than is necessary to cover the full cost of operations. We're not in this to make a profit. But sometimes we get reactions like this. We did a statewide survey in a state a few years back, and based on that survey, a community released this press release where the first sentence was, once again, the city's water department proved to have some of the lowest water and sewage rates in the state. What they took out of the survey was they looked and saw, wow, we're at the bottom end of it, and that's really great. And, for all I know, this particular system is really efficient with their money and cuts costs and is doing a great job. But it's just as likely, or sadly perhaps more likely, that they're not really putting money aside for future capital needs. Maybe they're not covering their debt service. Those financial indicators that we have are not looking very good. And so I think we need to be careful about this kind of mentality of low rates for the sake of low rates. And instead, I think we want to think about whether the rates we charge are sufficient to cover the full cost of operations. And obviously, most of the revenue we get are from the charges that we levy to customers for their water use. But it's worth noting that there are some non-recurring or one-time charges as well. There are penalties that you may charge for non-payment or disconnection. Some of you may rent out space on your water tanks for cell phone or radio receivers. I've even met a system that sold space on their water tank for billboard ads as a source of revenue. You may charge tap or connection fees to systems to individuals or businesses when they connect to your system. There are also system development charges that can be levied when larger developments are coming in and will require significant upgrades to your equipment. And then obviously, as we mentioned, there are grants available. But most of the revenue comes from your rates. And the question that we often get is, well, how do we get these rates to be right? What does it mean for rates to be right? And I think when we get this question, what we like to start off with is asking, well, what are you trying to do with your rates? You know, are you trying for full cost recovery or revenue stability? Are you trying to encourage conservation? Are you trying to foster business-friendly practices? Are you trying to maintain affordability? Some combination, some other objectives? And I think obviously, you know, with the key financial indicators, that's really getting to the issue of full cost recovery. And I think that's an objective that really all water and wastewater systems should have very high. But in Minnesota, encouraging conservation is always going to be a priority because of your water supply planning requirements. So because of those requirements, conservation is often an objective and should be a high objective for you. And as we'll look at rate structures, it often means that most of you have increasing block rates. So we know that conservation is going to be a priority right up there with full cost recovery, but some of these other things may be priorities as well. And it's important to start the conversation about whether or not your rates are right by understanding what these objectives are and then understanding, again, the requirements that are out there from funders and understanding our current financial position. And then I think there's a couple of elements of the rate structure that we can look at to understand whether or not they're really as efficient at capturing costs as they should be. The first place that we could look at is how you distinguish between your customers. You know, do you charge the same rate structure for everybody, or do you vary it based on, say, residential versus commercial versus industrial customers, maybe based on, you know, whether they have a 3/4 inch meter versus a 2-inch meter versus a 10-inch meter, whether you serve people only inside your municipal boundaries or if you serve people outside. Perhaps you have negotiated a rate with a single large customer. Maybe that's a large user within your jurisdictional boundaries, or maybe you sell water in bulk to another water system. Whatever the case is, the first thing that we'll want to walk through with you is what are your customer classes, and the way you distinguish for customers, are you really adequately charging the right people the right costs? So, you know, if you have a monthly minimum charge of, say, $15, and, you know, Mrs. Jones, the widow, is paying $15, and some large industrial customer is paying $15, you know, is that a system that makes sense? You know, or do we need to make some distinctions based on, say, the meter size or the customer class and how we charge people for water? So this is one of the first things that we would want you to look at. The second thing is how often you bill your customers. Obviously, the more frequently you bill customers, the more revenue you get in on a regular basis, which helps with your cash flow. It'll also help your customers identify leaks more quickly. It's amazing how much water, say, a leaking toilet can run through in even just a matter of days, let alone a leak in somebody's yard that can be, you know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. And so we recommend monthly billing if you can afford it, because again, as we look at financial indicators, it will give you a little bit more of a reliable picture when you know the money's coming in regularly. Obviously, the advantage of quarterly billing or something less frequently than monthly is just the cost of billing goes down. So the cost of sending the bills and collecting the bills goes down. But generally speaking, I think the trend nationally is towards more frequent billing, more monthly billing, and that's what customers are used to generally with their utility bills. So also the question of the amount that you charge somebody just for being a water customer. Generally speaking, across the country, we find most water systems that charge customers, especially governmental systems, will charge it's either going to be a base charge or ready-to-use fee. Goes by a lot of different names, but essentially just something that you have in hand for this customer being hooked up to your system. Now, a higher base charge will allow you to cover your fixed costs better and have better revenue stability. My colleague Shadi Eskaf did a webinar on that just last Thursday that will be recorded and up on our website if you're interested in looking at that a little bit more. Lower base charges, though, are probably good when you're thinking about encouraging conservation, because the lower the base charge and then you're shifting more of the cost to the volumetric charge means that customers who save will see a reduction in their bill. And I think whenever we get to this question of a high versus low base charge, that question of the widow or the significantly small water customer who's on a fixed income will come into play. And affordability concerns are out there, that if you have a very high base charge and somebody doesn't use much water, the water becomes a little bit less affordable for them. Once you think about your base charge, you also have to think about whether or not you want to include any consumption in that base charge. I think the national trend here again is towards not including any. And for those of you who want to encourage conservation, which again, because of water supply planning in Minnesota is a priority, probably including a lower amount is better for that. We've seen some systems include quite a high amount, 3,000, 4,000, even 5,000 gallons a month. And I think what ends up happening is then most of their customers only pay the base charge. And then somewhere in the middle is what's generally considered to be the lifeline rate. So for that really low income, fixed income customer, they may say get 1,000 gallons of water, enough to live on. They're not going to have a really green lawn or a fancy swimming pool or hot tub or anything like that, but they know they've got enough for domestic use to live on, and it can be a reliable amount of money for them on a month in and month out basis. So this becomes another question in the equation, is how do we think about the consumption allowance within the base charge? And then finally, we want to know how to actually design rates based on the volume of water the customers use. And as we know in Minnesota, the most common way to do this is an increasing block rate structure because of the conservation requirements. So that means that the more water you use, the higher amount you'll pay per 1,000 gallons or 100 CCF, however you measure water. And there's a couple things that I think you'd want to think about to make sure that that block design is really effective. The first is to think about having the correct number of blocks. We've seen some structures that have 2 or 3 that are pretty simple and pretty easy to use. We've seen one in particular that we sometimes talk about that had 15 blocks. Every 1,000 gallons was a different block. Sometimes the price differential was only 13 cents. It really was not a good rate structure, and it caused a lot of confusion and didn't really do what it was intended to do. Where should those blocks start and end? And having a significant rate differential between them is going to help with that conservation encouragement, but also make sure you bring in appropriate revenue. You want to make sure that you read your meters punctually for increasing block, and then think about large families. The whole idea of increasing block is to cut into discretionary water use. But if you've got a multi-generational family in a house where per person they're not using that much water, but in total they are, it's going to be harder for them to conserve water. So something to consider in that block design. And as you look at these rates and as you look at your financial indicators, we really strongly recommend, whether you're going for the project priority list in a given year or not, the best practice is that you want to review your rates on an annual basis. Now, that does not mean that you have to change your rates every year. If you run your operating ratio and debt service coverage and the other numbers we talked about, and they're really strong, and you look at your rate setting objectives and you feel like your rate structure is meeting those objectives and you've got the money coming in, you probably don't need to make any changes to your rates in that given year, but you're not going to know unless you take the time to really do a thorough review. And again, for small systems, and if you'd like a hand with it, we're happy to help under our grant. The other thing, though, to consider is that the cost of running a water system increases every year regardless of any other changes, just because of inflation. The cost of power may go up, the cost of chemicals may go up. Allegedly, salaries are going up on a regular basis, although I know many governmental units have had freezes on those for a while. And so we have seen some water systems that have decided to raise their rates automatically every year based on inflation at the very least. And then if an additional rate increase is warranted, that they would go to their council and propose that and work with council on getting that passed as well. And I think the bottom line of all of this, for any of you that are considering capital improvements, whether now or in the future, is that, I don't think we want to be like the water system putting out the press release bragging about low rates, because low rates, as I said, if you're a very efficient system and you can keep your costs down and you can cover your future capital needs, then by all means, do that. But I think low rates for the sake of low rates can be dangerous because it can come at the expense of your system's financial health. It may mean that you're going to have to do a sudden rate increase in the future, or it may mean that your system starts to fail, and it may mean that it endangers public health and the environment. And I think all of us who are in this business know that we have an enormous responsibility towards our customers to keep them healthy and safe with the water that we have and the wastewater that we treat, keep the environment healthy and safe. And we need to be able to pay for that service. And we're going to need to be able to pay for it in order to really take advantage of those programs we talked about at the beginning that the project priority list feeds into, whether it's the SRF program or USDA or any of the others. And so as you take a look at your rate changes on an annual basis, keep in mind that that's what it's really about, is that revenue sufficiency and full cost recovery, and that's the goal that we want to be shooting for as water systems, and we want to have healthy numbers. And I don't think I've ever seen a press release come out from a water system bragging about their operating ratio, but it would make my day if we ever saw one. I will say, if you'd like a little bit more detail on these rate setting topics, my colleague Shadi Eskaf, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, he did that webinar last week. He put together this guide written for system managers about how to set rates. It was originally written for the state of North Carolina, but it's really applicable to any state. I guess with the exception, again, in Minnesota, of there's other options for volumetric rates that typically are not going to work in the state because of the water supply planning process. But this, you'll have this slide available to go download this guide if you're interested. And again, would be happy to talk to you at any time about it. So we are at the top of the hour, and we're scheduled to go a few more minutes because I want to be able to answer any questions that you have. So please, if you have any, put them into the questions box. But before and while we give you a chance to do that, we actually have a couple of questions for you. One will be related to that technical assistance I've mentioned a few times, so we'll put a poll question up about that if you're interested. And then the other one will be related to a blog that we write on water finance and other environmental finance topics. And if you'd like to be subscribed to that, we'll give you an opportunity for that as well. So Savannah, can you go ahead and pull up the first poll question for us, please?
Of course.
All right. And our first question here is on the blog, if you are interested in subscribing to that.
And we'll give a few more seconds to input your answers. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And the next polling question is if you would be interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance for your small water system. And if you're unsure about technical assistance or don't have the opportunity at this point to input your answer, you can review the technical assistance form on the efcnetwork.org website. And a few seconds left to input your answers. Getting ready to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, in the chat box, I am sending out a survey link. If you could please take a few minutes to fill out how you thought today's session went. And you'll also receive this survey in the follow-up email sent to you this afternoon. And Glenn, I don't see any questions coming in. We'll give a few more minutes, but I just want to thank you for the thorough presentation this afternoon, and all the attendees online. Thank you for joining us today. And do you have any additional closing comments that you would like to add?
Yeah, well, we'll just give folks a minute if they have some questions. I feel like I want to emphasize the point I made at the beginning, that the funding program representatives and the level of funding coordination within the state of Minnesota, it is there to really help you as water and wastewater systems have the money that you need to protect public health and serve your customers. I've worked very closely with folks in these funding agencies, and many of you have as well, and you know that they really want to hear from you. They want to see you on this project priority list. I very much doubt that there's any water system out there, unless it's one that's very new, that doesn't have needs in the next 5 years coming up. and that, I really encourage you to take advantage of those resources that the state has available. And again, those decisions of your projects are going to be based on the public health and environmental needs that arise from the work that needs to be done. But the simple fact is that without having a strong financial background for your system, it's going to be very difficult for you to take advantage of those programs. And so with the opportunity to measure your financial health, to take a look at some of the spreadsheet tools we have, and then especially to look at how to raise the revenue to meet those goals, it's not so much of a scientific measurement in a lot of ways as my colleague Jeff calls it. Rate setting is a painful art. And I think it's one that would like to give you a hand with and to think through these different elements, so that way you've got the structure in place to meet those objectives, and then obviously we can help you with the numbers as well. And we have a few spreadsheet tools related to future capital planning needs and the impact on rates, and looking at alternative rate structures, and also looking at the affordability of rates. And so all of those resources we'll send out to you as well in a PDF document if you're interested in accessing any of those.
Wonderful. Yeah, as you said in the beginning, the best resource is the efcnetwork.org website.
Right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we will wrap up a couple minutes early. I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for attending this morning. I hope you found the session useful. It will be recorded, and so if you'd like to share it with others in your water systems, or I know we have some representatives from the consulting community on, if you'd like to use this with some of the other communities that you work with, please do so. And again, just a thank you to Chad and Bill and Becky and Jeff for their assistance in thinking through how to make our content most appropriate for systems in Minnesota. And you've got my phone number and email up there. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And I wish you all a good rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thank you so much for joining us.